Buenos días con todos. Agradecer a los que nos acompañan dentro del Zoom y a los que nos siguen por las redes. En nombre de la Cámara Peruana de Café y Cacao, es para mí un honor y un gusto poder compartir esta sesión de nuestra 24ª Convención Nacional del Café. Esta edición es especial para nosotros de un tema que la gente nos ha preguntado bastante y que queremos aprender, que es el mercado del cacao. Hoy vamos a ver las principales tendencias y el panorama del mercado mundial de cacao, y para eso contamos con la participación de una de las personas más referentes, que es la señora Judith James. Judith ha trabajado en diversas compañías como Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, Prudential, y actualmente dirija Cacao Insights y JG Judith Gaines Consulting, que es una de las fuentes más buscadas para ver el comercio de commodities. Cuenta con más de 40 años de experiencia y un amplio reconocimiento en el mercado internacional, y sus presentaciones son siempre bien valoradas y recibidas. Para los que están dentro del Zoom, pueden aplicar, como bien lo dijo María Victoria, la traducción, y para los que nos siguen en redes van a poder después seguirlo en inglés y después in- vamos a poner la traducción ni bien termine la sesión. Los comentarios de esta importante sesión van a estar a cargo de José Mejía. Él es presidente del Comité de Café y Cacao de ADEX, un gremio bastante importante en nuestro país, y también gerente general de Amazonas Trading, una de las principales empresas del sector en el país. Sin más, le damos el pase a Judith, agradeciendo y mucho su participación y esperando a todos el interés por acompañarnos en esta presentación.
Okay, thank you so much. Greetings, everybody, and I hope that next year we're in person as opposed to doing this through Zoom. The cocoa market has been very interesting this year in that where other markets charged higher, the prices raced up sharply. Cocoa has been sort of sideways, and most recently, as other markets collapse back down in value, the cocoa market has been able to maintain a relatively stable range. And so some of the volatility that was seen in the market for the past several years, the market has been quieter than most commodities. And what has happened is that there's called a standoff between the bullish side of the fundamentals and the bearish side that has kept the market pretty much trapped in this sideways pattern. And I really don't see that changing very much in the months ahead. And the reason for that is because we're looking at a situation where the weather at this time of year is potentially transitioning from a La Nina to El Nino, and that's getting people worried, and that's providing some of the downside support to the market. Others would say, well, everybody loves chocolate, and therefore demand isn't going to fall apart during a global recession, and demand typically doesn't fall all that much. And so this has kept the market in this sideways range, and we're towards the lower end of it right now, but we've consistently seen this market bounce back. And so I'm expecting that same pattern to persist. So here I have a chart going back through 2016, and you could see some of the market extremes and how in recent years, call it since 2020, the market, every time that it's attempted to break down, has found very good underpinning. And so I think this is the new normal for at least the intermediate term. There isn't any major weather concerns at this time to disrupt the market and bring it much higher. But at the same time, I don't see the market fading and sinking too far either. So right now, the focus is still on 21-22 production, but so the current season, which ends in September, but I'd rather look ahead to 22-23 since we've already pretty much known what some of the harvest numbers are for this year. And what I'm expecting is a slight improvement overall in production next year. I am not looking for production to hit a record level as it did 2 years ago. And as a result, the market is going to stay in fairly close balance. There isn't any reason right now to believe that there's any major production problems. The weather has been fairly acceptable. It's been decent in the prime West African nations. And we'll see this on-off pattern of production where we're in a cyclically up year, but again, not looking for a dramatic rise. We haven't had the price increases. We also have higher input costs this year because of the hikes in diesel and in fertilizers, and that's going to keep the production increases more moderate for 22-23, in my opinion. International Cocoa Organization has not yet released any numbers for next season. They've released two numbers. First, the initial forecast for the 21-22 season, and then a second revision to that. They put out 4 forecast year quarterly numbers, and they only put out most recently the numbers for 21-22, that second revision. So the numbers that I'm speaking about for 22-23 are my own opinions. When we look at the breakdown between the Ivory Coast and Ghana, we have very different situation where the Ivory Coast has been able to see production in a fairly strong uptrend. We had 20 years ago, time passes quickly, the civil war that broke out in the Ivory Coast, and that slowed production growth. But then the government focused in the past decade on rehabilitation programs and striving to improve cocoa production again. There was also a lot of forested areas that moved into production, and you had higher yielding varieties, less disease resistant, helping to boost Ivory Coast production. Ghana also had a plan for rehabilitating older farms and trying to push to also increase production, and had lofty ideas about that. But the weather didn't cooperate as much. Mother Nature didn't cooperate as much in Ghana as in the Ivory Coast. And so when there were periods of dryness, Ghana was more impacted than the Ivory Coast. There's also some issues in terms of some additional labor shortages in Ghana. And so Ghana is, has 1 year of this jump up in production and then fails to have the follow through on that. And this seems to be the pattern. For the 21-22 season, you would have seen a far greater situation where the market was in deep surplus if it were not for the sharp plunge in Ghana's cocoa production. Their numbers were very disappointing this year compared to what was seen as a modest decline in the Ivory Coast. Now for 22-23, I'm not expecting production to bounce back because you still had some weather issues, and we're transitioning again towards an El Nino, which tends to hurt production in West Africa. So we're going into more neutral conditions, and the La Nina phase is typically when you have stronger production in West Africa. And we didn't see that the second year in Ghana following that record crop 2 years ago or last year. And so only expecting a modest uptick for Ghana. So for this reason, and considering these countries produce about 70% of world output, I'm not expecting a major surplus for 22-23. I think that we're going to see less of a production deficit and maybe very small surplus, but that's about it. And that's why I don't see the cocoa market tumbling along with other commodities, and that we're only going to see more sideways activity. When we look at production elsewhere, we could see certainly the steady growth that we had in Peru and then a leveling off in production. And that was very similar to what we had in Brazil. And it's really Ecuador that has continued to see the strides in production, and for next year, only expecting slight growth in Ecuador. And again, it's the similar situation where we have much higher costs right now, and that's going to, in my opinion, impact fertilizer use and prices. While they're holding stable, are not at extremely attractive levels given the rising costs for inputs and then also for labor. And so I'm only looking for moderated production increases. When we're looking at Asia, you could see that there's, a growing importance for Asia as a hub for cocoa grinding, okay, whereas production continues to fall behind. And when you look at Europe, you could see that certainly Europe maintains a strong lead against other countries, but you're seeing again where Asia is gaining fast. Now in Africa, much of the grind is in the Ivory Coast and then secondly in Ghana, but that's all exported to consumer nations such as in Europe and the United States. In Asia, what you're looking at is development in many countries and rapidly increasing demand that has driven the increased grind. And it's also taking away from the grind in the Americas and cutting into the share for Europe, because many of these countries in Asia would have imported more product from Europe and from the Americas, but now is looking to have the value add and grind domestically. The two major countries, Malaysia and Indonesia, and both of those countries had very high production in prior years and was not able to sustain their production. And instead, those countries have focused on developing the value add and grinding cocoa and importing cocoa to meet the demand in the region. But certainly Asian demand is catching up fast and now exceeds that of both the Americas and of Africa. When we talk about cocoa demand, I have this chart here, and what it shows is long-term annual cocoa grind. And when you do an average, it's around 3%. So in a normal year, you would expect about 3% annual average growth in demand. And there's very few years, as you can see, where cocoa demand actually declined. And I'd rather, instead of saying cocoa demand, I'd say grind of cocoa, which is a proxy for demand, fell. And those years, it was because of extremely high prices rather than consumers really slowing their intake of chocolate. And so grind fell by some extreme levels in the early 2000s, and then about a decade later. And then you sort, even if you look at the financial crisis, the grind recovered very rapidly. And so you could have periods where there's successive years of very strong grind, and then it moderates. But again, very, very few years where grind tends to fall sharply. What I'm looking at for this season, we have very moderated demand growth compared to last year's. We started to pull out of the pandemic, and we're seeing that grind is going to stay below the historic average. But I'm not expecting, even in a recession, for grind to decline next season for 22-23. We don't have the prices to suggest that the grind should fall. What I do see happening, though, is there could be some shifts in where the grind is because of high natural gas prices in Europe. And so it's possible that Peru, Ecuador might be able to pick up market share in demand, okay, in the grind, or Ivory Coast and Ghana, because of higher manufacturing costs in Europe. And Asia, there might be a pickup in some of that demand also. So what I see more so than grind collapsing and falling down is that there could be some shifts in the market share dislocation from Europe to other areas that will benefit from that. When we're looking at global inventories, and this is another reason why I'm not looking at a major turndown in cocoa prices relative to what I would expect in other commodities, is that inventory levels in cocoa are fairly stable right now. And when you look at inventory levels relative to demand, so the stocks to use ratio, they're actually fairly tight. And so there's no reason to suggest that the market should tumble because there's a huge buildup in stocks on a global level. What we're looking at is that overall global supplies are just sufficient. They're not at any extreme levels, and there's really no cushion or room for a major production problem. If we do have a problem next year in the Ivory Coast or Ghana or in Ecuador, then the market certainly would have cause for concern because you don't have that large buffer of supply on a global basis. So this is nominal stocks, and over time the stock levels have to increase with the rise in global demand. So even though stocks are higher than they were 8 years ago, you need higher stocks as to feed the supply chain. And therefore, stocks right now relative to demand are on the low side. So this is, certainly that picture where you could see the stocks to use ratio is the lowest that it's been in a very long time, suggesting that the market could have tightness if there's any production problem. There just isn't, again, a backlog of supplies. There's not high inventories on a global basis, and that should help the market maintain current prices. When we talk about inventory levels, I want to distinguish from global stocks to stocks in the United States that are certified for delivery against the New York contract. Those stocks have actually been increasing and are close to record levels. 2 years ago, those stocks fell to very low levels, and it created a very extreme situation where one major candy manufacturer stood in to take delivery of supply, and the cocoa wasn't in place. It was really in Europe and needed to be in the US, and that created a disallocation, and the market raced sharply higher. And of course, the response to that was to bring all the supply to the board. And so there's this cushion in certified stocks that wasn't there 2 years ago. But it doesn't mean that overall global supplies are in abundance. It's just you're not going to see a situation develop again as we had previously, where suddenly a manufacturer is trying to take delivery and it creates a squeeze scenario in the marketplace. In the coffee market, you have the opposite situation, where right now the level of certified stocks has been coming down, and that helped to provide some underpinning to the coffee market in the past 2 weeks on fears that if stocks continue to fall, it could create a potential squeeze play in the market and force coffee prices up. But this is just really a dynamic regarding the marketplace and the deliverable supplies against New York, and isn't really reflective of the total global picture, which is in the end what really matters most. Now, during the pandemic and even prior to that, there were some trends that developed in the marketplace when we look at the byproducts of cocoa beans. So we're looking at the cocoa butter and the cocoa powder. And the market certainly watches the pricing on a ratio basis of butter and powder relative to cocoa beans. And this is, to me, more reflective of what demand is in the marketplace. And what we had for the longest time was that cocoa powder prices were severely depressed, and cocoa butter prices had been trending higher and higher relative to the price of cocoa beans. Now, what that suggested was that butter supplies were tighter than powder, and that would be reflective of good demand for quality chocolate. Okay, so premium chocolate was in higher demand, and therefore more butter was being consumed. And suddenly, when prices got too high, we began to see a shift in demand, and we had an increase in grind, and that created a buildup in cocoa butter. And then certainly with the pandemic initially, we began to see cocoa butter prices starting to fall at a faster rate. And we've also seen this rapid increase in powder prices relative to cocoa beans at a much faster rate than the decline in cocoa butter. So that excess supply is being utilized. But there's something else I want to point out here, and that is consumer trends. What is behind this action? We've seen it before, where cocoa butter demand falls and there's a substitution for cocoa butter. And we're seeing the narrowing in the spread between these two pricing. What I see as a dangerous situation in terms of overall cocoa demand is that some of the increase in powder is not just because of a temporary switch over from butter to meet demand because of pricing, that there's a longer term issue in terms of new product development and consumer trends. And so what we're seeing is that some of the bar sizes for higher end premium chocolates is shrinking. and therefore consumers are buying smaller bars, and that impacts usage. The other thing is that there's a trend towards or shift in snacking patterns where people are buying functional protein bars, fiber bars for sports and nutrition as meal replacements, and they're not buying traditional candy bars. And so the grab and go at convenience stores, or if you go to a store like Whole Foods, aisles and aisles of bars everywhere that are using far less chocolate. And people are using that as their energy provider mid-morning or afternoon, and while commuting, just eating a bar that's labeled as healthy and functional, meeting dietary needs, whereas candy bars are still in that negative connotation of you're having junk food. And some of the calorie content and nutrition in some of these bars isn't much different than your traditional candy bars, but this snacking trend is hurting cocoa usage more so than probably anything else that I've seen in my nearly 40 years covering this market. There are times where prices have been high and manufacturers of baked products have shifted to cocoa butter equivalents, or we've seen in some packaged chocolate chip cookies, they put fewer chocolate chips in it, thinner coatings, shrinking bar sizes. This is very different because it isn't the manufacturer actions that are changing this temporarily, but instead it's consumers moving away from traditional candy bars with lots of chocolate to some of these healthier eating habits that have much less chocolate and are usually made with cocoa powder. So you have compound chocolate as opposed to using more cocoa content in the individual units. And so I see that as a problem. And I think that's one of the reasons why the cocoa butter demand has been sliding, whereas powder prices have been improving. And so when we look at the combined ratio of cocoa powder and butter, we look at the combined ratio because what is attractive for manufacturers who want to grind beans and then sell the byproducts and have a reasonable profit. So what are their margins? And we had been at levels last year where it was very unattractive for grinders to benefit from the combination of having to sell powder and butter as butter prices were falling. But as powder prices have lifted up here, the margins are starting to improve. That should help to support or at least prevent cocoa grind from falling sharply, and seeing some of that improvement as margins are beginning to pick up and are somewhat profitable right now. Are they at the super strong levels we've seen in the past that encourage very strong grind? No. And that's why I'm looking for only a moderate increase to relatively flat grind for the season ahead. And so with that, certainly I'm happy to take any questions, and I appreciate all your attention. And copies of this presentation and also the one that I did on coffee about a month ago are certainly available for you.
Muchas gracias, Judith. Bastante interesante, un panorama complejo, con tendencias distintas entre la producción, el consumo y las zonas. Quiero agradecer a los que nos permiten organizar esta convención, en particular a la cooperación suiza, SECO, con la que gestionamos el proyecto Alianza para el Café Competitivo, y también a USAID, que mediante TecnoSurf y Alianza para el Cacao nos permiten estar llevando adelante este esfuerzo. Hay otras empresas más y otros aliados como PNUD, iremos mencionándolos de pocos. Pero este panorama, José Antonio, ¿cómo lo ves? El cacao se mantiene más estable que el café. En un mundo cambiante, el cacao parece que tiene una tendencia sólida. ¿Cómo es para un país como el Perú, que está creciendo probablemente un poco por encima de esa velocidad? ¿Cómo lo ves?
Bueno, sí, gracias por la exposición. Ha sido bastante bueno conocer los indicadores macro que tiene el mercado del cacao en los próximos años. Sí, yo lo veo estable, como tú dices, pero también con algunos fundamentos relativamente negativos, ¿no? Como dice Judy, la demanda se viene un poco contrayendo, se viene contrayendo. Si bien es cierto, por el lado de la demanda, siempre teníamos un promedio de demanda de 2.5, 3% por año en incremento, todos los años se incrementaba, pero para la próxima temporada ya se ve que va a ser menos de 1, 0.5 o menos. Entonces, por ese lado, sí hay una preocupación de no se va a alcanzar niveles que tuvimos en el 2018, 2019, de llegar a $3,000 en bolsa. Pienso que se va a mantener en un rango menor a de lo que hemos visto el año pasado, ¿no? Que fue precios hasta 2.900, 2.800. Pienso que vamos a establecer entre un rango desde 2.200 a 2.750 en un rango en los próximos meses o años, ¿no? La producción, bueno, como dijo Judy, Ghana se vio que se cayó 30% de su producción el año pasado, o terminando la cosecha de ahora, pero ya prácticamente esta disminución se viene siendo constante. Entonces ya el mercado asumió esa disminución de producción, ¿no? De tal forma que no esperemos que se traduzca a un incremento de precio, ¿no? En Perú, bueno, estamos empezando la cosecha grande, ¿no? La cosecha grande empezó ahora en junio, con mucha fuerza, y se espera que esté en los próximos 2, 3 meses más. Sin embargo, los precios en campo siguen muy altos, casi no siguen la secuencia de los precios de bolsa, debido a que Perú siempre ha sido un país que tradicionalmente ha exportado un 30% de su producción como cacao orgánico o cacao certificado, ¿no? Fuera de bolsa, que tiene un precio o un premio adicional a la bolsa. Sin embargo, el problema de las nuevas regulaciones de la Unión Europea con los pesticidas prohibidos, que son el clorpirifos, los glifosatos y el fosetil, hace de que este 30% de producción orgánica se vea totalmente amenazada, de tal forma que tenemos muchos rechazos, tenemos muchas inmovilizaciones de cacao orgánico que no se puede exportar porque tiene trazas de estos pesticidas. En tal sentido, estos precios que hay en campo no están perjudicando realmente las exportaciones, porque al final va a ser todo un cacao orgánico que muchas veces va a tener que ser degradado a convencional, ¿no? Y las pérdidas de los exportadores van a ser muy fuertes, ¿no? En Perú todavía tenemos ese problema con el cacao, porque en campo se toman precios de cacao a veces fuera de bolsa, ¿no? O sea, fuera de bolsa o pensando que va a ser orgánico, que va a ser certificado de alguna forma, y después finalmente a la hora de exportarlo es un cacao degradado, ¿no? Con mucha degradación, vendido a menores precios, y pienso que este año va a ser un año de pisar tierra, a muchas cooperativas van a estar afectadas por esto, por la disminución, y a varios exportadores también, ¿no? Básicamente. Nada más, y bueno, agradecerte nuevamente, David, por esta oportunidad de dirigirme, y a Judy por la excelente exposición. Gracias.
Gracias. Hay varias preguntas, Judith, que están haciendo. Las vamos a ir leyendo
Okay.
una por una con María Victoria. Pero retomando lo que decía José Mejía, un comentario general sobre las tendencias del mercado del cacao certificado. No sé si nos podrías dar algunos lineamientos de cómo va esto.
Okay. One thing I'd like to comment on is in terms of actually, in response to Jose's comment on the organic. I actually think that there's demand for Peruvian chocolate in the United States and the organic, and the market, it's a little different than the legislation in Europe, which is a little stricter, and that's something that you might want to consider. A closer neighbor. And I'm seeing also in other countries where there's growing demand for chocolate. Even, I live in Panama, and the market for chocolate is growing rapidly there. And there's a couple of Panamanian brands of chocolate, but I think that there's a lot of stores that import a lot of chocolate from Venezuela and from Ecuador. And I think that Peru should look at expanding some of the markets there to maintain a strong presence, because your chocolate's excellent. So I wouldn't despair that there are outlets for your product. Commenting on the market in general, I mean, one of the things we're looking at is that commodities rise and fall together. Okay, so all boats in the same water move up and they move down. And cocoa, as I mentioned, has been away from this past year, which is very different than in years past. We can't overlook the higher cost of manufacturing and the impact from natural gas and what manufacturers are going to do as a result of this. And so I always like to say, when there's lemons, find a way to make it into lemonade. And that there's potential opportunities to showcase Peruvian chocolate. If manufacturers in Europe are closing, then find a way to seek the market separately for the Peruvian chocolate. And so because the underlying consumer demand is there, but you might have the manufacturing costs too high in some of your other countries. And then it's a matter of seeking out new buyers because they're there. And so you just can't let the market dictate some of the, let the situation in Europe or what's expected to create a problem for you. So I'm more optimistic about your outlook for demand. And I hope that, you can take some of that positive enthusiasm and turn to something even better.
Ok, sí. Bueno, tenemos varias preguntas, Judith. Y antes te quería decir, sí, yo creo que el próximo año vamos a estar acá en Lima presencialmente, sí. Creo que la demanda, tanto la de café de cacao, amerita que el próximo año nos veamos. Y vamos a pasar antes de pasar a atender las varias preguntas que van a aparecer según las han formulado. La primera es en español, pediré a María Victoria que la traduzca cuando aparezca en pantalla. Quiero agradecer también a los que nos han apoyado, nos apoyan con esta convención. Además de los señalados está Romex, está Olam, está Molinos y compañía, Mediterranean Shipping Company, Aicasa, Sharp, FedEx, Rainforest Alliance, el Ministerio de Agricultura. Son ellos los que nos permiten estar acá, y no se olviden que la próxima semana tenemos la convención presencial donde también con José Antonio abordaremos la tendencia del mercado nacional. Ahora sí, procedamos a las preguntas, por favor, las vamos a poner. Ujú.
Okay, so one of the reasons why demand isn't expected to increase, even though prices are relatively stable, is first, this worrisome trend about consuming more bars that are made with powder instead of a higher cacao content. So that is a global problem impacting demand. If you go into countries all over the world, you're seeing more of these snack bars, and they have a lower cacao content, these nutritional bars, than candy bars. The reason why I think that demand isn't going to grow as much is because you have the other ingredient, while cocoa prices have been stable, the other ingredient prices have gone up tremendously. And so is the cost of production because of higher fuel prices and shipping and packaging and labor. So it's really nothing to do with the price of cocoa beans, but the price of milk and sugar and all the our nuts. Everything has coconut, everything has gone up in price, and therefore actions are being taken to try and rein in costs and the margins. And the way that manufacturers tend to do that is by shrinking the packaging size. And therefore, they're increasing their price by shrinking the packaging, and therefore consumers are buying less. And so it's putting consumers on a diet. It really doesn't have anything to do with the consumers turning away from chocolate, but the actions by manufacturers to maintain their margins because the high ingredient costs. I was actually talking to someone the other day, and when you add up the ingredient costs for a compound chocolate, which would be of lower quality, it's actually was more expensive than having a higher cocoa content bar. So, some of the extreme dark chocolate bars or higher cacao content bars that have less sugar and don't have milk in them have a lower cost for manufacturing than the ones that have the additional ingredients. And that's part of the problem. But okay, but let me just add that I do my part, because I think every day, my entire life since I was about 5 years old, I've consumed tremendous amounts of chocolate. So that never stops. I'm very, very consistent. And I probably consume about half a kilo a day. Well, climate change is something that every farmer around the world, no matter what they're growing, has to adapt to. And some of that is going to have to be technology and developing clonal varieties that are more resistant to some of the climatic changes. So it's a matter of providing different nutrients. So are you going to have to change the composition of the fertilizers to maintain nutrients? Are you going to have shorter growing cycles? This is what's happening for some of the soybean and cotton farmers, where they recognize the changes, and Monsanto and others are developing seed varieties to try to accommodate that. So disease resistant, drought resistant, how do you provide sufficient water? How do you work against a increase in temperatures and water? How do you counter that? Because otherwise you're just going to lose some areas for production, and that's going to be very sad for the farmers that are impacted. So technology has to come into play. In the coffee market, if you look at Brazil certainly is a country that has had different climatic factors and changes. You've had increase in extreme conditions, and you've had more wildfires than in years past. And you had back-to-back droughts. And then you had last year, there were 3 frosts in the month of July, which was unheard of. The only other time there was 2 freezes, and this time there were 3 freezes in one season, was back in 1994. So very extreme conditions. And what Brazilian farmers are doing to compensate and improve things is they're increasing the density of their planting. So they're having greater yields per hectare because they have more trees on their plots. And so that's helping to increase the income. And there are also on many farms, you see intercropping. So in some of the Robusta areas, there's intercropping with pepper, and also with durian, and with papaya. And other areas, there's a lot of mango and avocado that's being grown. And then in some of the coffee areas, you're seeing soybeans that are growing between the rows of coffee because soybean prices were so high. And so farmers are trying to figure out ways to increase their income, even if prices are depressed, by not only relying on the single crop. And then also, how do you maximize your profitability?
Ok, gracias. Yo quiero hacer una pregunta antes de María Victoria. Bueno, nosotros acá hemos hecho una encuesta entre el público y, por ejemplo, los asistentes consideran que Perú mantendrá o aumentará su producción este año, lo mismo que su producción certificada. O sea, somos bastante optimistas en el Perú, eso me alegra. Quería hacer una pregunta respecto a Perú está diversificando su exportación de cacao. Ahora solo la mitad es en grano y lo otro son en derivados. Y quería saber si esta tendencia es global, se mantendrá, porque eso modifica también un poco el comercio y como has mostrado los precios. ¿Cómo ves eso hacia el futuro?
Well, Peru, very much like other countries, is trying to increase value add by increasing grind, and not only, and I think, look at what's happening, the success, say in Ecuador, where you've had production and grind develop together, and where you've had, I mentioned in Asia, where even though production was falling, Malaysia hardly produces any cocoa at all, but they have very strong grind. And Indonesia has seen 10, 15 years of falling production, but maintain their grind because they're selling the value add production. In terms of Peru, it would be wonderful if Peru could continue to expand, because I know that as a very high quality producer, there's the demand for your chocolate. And then to capture additional value add and continue to develop marketing and the demand for Peruvian chocolate as a standalone single origin in the premium market. That's where I see the position. So it's decommoditizing Peru. And so Peru should stand separate from blending with other origins and force the single origin, and that people recognize Peru and continue to market and promote Peru as an exceptional chocolate.
Gracias. ¿Hay alguna pregunta más, María Victoria? Creo que para 3 más, por favor.
Well, there's a lot of NGOs, and I think that the government has to work with the industry and find investors. There's a lot of capital that is available around the world from who are looking to make investments and who are lending money. There's been a shift over a 20-year period of who is financing farmers and where the capital is coming from. And so the traditional banks are no longer the go-to for getting loans and assistance, that there's more, you want to call it humanitarian relief for loans and not-for-profit organizations who are looking to invest and develop in different countries. Now, one thing that happens is that there's an ebb and flow in this money, and there's risk on, risk off. So where there's perceived increased risk in a country because it might not be stable, then the money tends to flow out. So, you know, I don't want to single out any particular country, but in Central America and some of your neighboring countries, this becomes apparent on a more regular basis. Peru has opportunities to seek out private relationships with lenders and some of the large capital money that's out there. And I think that there's opportunities for investment and development, and that they have to be looked at carefully and considered. And partnering with different organizations. So that's where the money is right now for investment. Okay, so you can't have conventional cocoa that's sold as organic, but you can have organic that's sold as conventional. Okay, so because if it's conventional cocoa and labeled as organic and it's not, then consumers are paying that premium who want the organic. But if there isn't enough of a developed market for organic, then the price drops down and is sold as conventional. This is one of the problems with some of the certification programs. So it's always like fair trade was always synonymous with organic, and the market and the promise for the higher prices and the premiums for being part of the certification programs, the exuberance for that exceeded the growth in the market demand for the products. And this is not just a factor that's impacting Peru, but it's impacting and for the cacao, but you're also seeing it in coffee, because I cover both these markets. And there's a lot of coffee that was grown that was supposed to be sold under a certification program, and growers invested heavily in trying to certify their farms, and then they're not getting the reward for it because their coffee is being sold conventional as opposed to fair trade organic with the additional premiums. And simply that the demand on a global basis didn't meet the total for what the certification programs were hoping to have. And so that becomes a problem. And I think a lot of people became disenchanted because they've spent a lot of money and investment in some of the programs that couldn't deliver. And so there's been a consolidation in that. And so that's why I sort of said, if you can promote Peruvian chocolate as a superior product and help in the marketing, then consumers will demand it and maybe be willing to pay a higher price as a specialty chocolate, as, ooh, I want Peruvian chocolate, as opposed to only relying on the assistance of some of the certification programs. You know, it's one of these things where you have to help yourself. And you have the product, now you just have to push on the marketing side and the efforts.
Sí,
And
más bien.
yeah, some of that is even, you know, doing more of having tastings and programs and having some international attention for certification and, you know, labeling and awards on the packaging and saying how great it is. And consumers are willing to buy that. Let it stand out.
Sí, gracias. Más bien, José Mejía había levantado la mano y también te han hecho una pregunta por el chat. Vamos a ir procesando dos últimas preguntas, María Victoria, para terminar. Adelante, José.
Ya, sí, yo solo quería precisar esto del cacao orgánico, ¿no? El cacao certificado. Claro, yo pienso que sí existe la demanda y la demanda paga muy bien para el cacao orgánico. Sin embargo, en los últimos años ya se ha habido algunos rechazos por presencia de pesticidas. O sea, el cacao que se vende encuentran pesticidas, ¿no? Y al ser un foro de productores, dirigido a productores, bueno, tenemos que mencionarlo, ¿no? Si fuera un foro dirigido a clientes, de repente no lo mencionaríamos, pero es un foro dirigido a productores y exportadores. Entonces, sí, ha habido rechazos, de tal forma que este año la autoridad europea ha implementado un doble check para todo lo que es producción orgánica. O sea, ningún lote de cacao orgánico va a ser exportado sin antes haber sido analizado por el mismo cuerpo de certificación orgánica en el puerto mismo, en el puerto. Va a ser inmovilizado y de tal forma que lo van a analizar ahí, ¿no? Ahora, ya no solamente se analiza la cromatografía de pesticidas, sino adicionalmente han puesto moléculas como el glifosato y el fosetil, de tal forma que gran parte de la producción orgánica realmente sí está amenazada porque no va a poder entrar a Europa. Ahora, Europa compra el 80% del cacao orgánico que produce Perú, ¿no? La demanda de Estados Unidos es más pequeña, ¿no? Si bien es cierto, Estados Unidos solamente ha puesto la prohibición del clorpirifos, que es también una prohibición total, que no se puede exportar cacao con clorpirifos. Con el glifosato sí todavía lo permiten. O sea, en Estados Unidos es un poco más flexible, pero tampoco no se le puede mandar cualquier cacao, ¿no? Entonces, sí hay que tener cuidado ahí, ¿no? Y esto al ser un foro de productores es bueno recalcarlo, ¿no? Debemos tener cuidado, no se puede vender cualquier cacao y no se puede pensar, hay mucha contaminación cruzada en Perú, ¿no? Entonces, eso va a ser un problema, ¿no? Que tenemos que tratar de manejarlo, ¿no? Y no sé qué pregunta exista, David, más.
Una pregunta que te hicieron era sobre el cacao fino de aroma. Digamos, ¿qué parte del mercado es? ¿Cómo lo ves tú dentro de la oferta?
Mira, yo el fino de aroma tiene mucho éxito en Perú. Es un cacao que no es SN51. Perú tiene un blend muy bueno, es muy reconocido. Varias empresas ya estamos haciendo catación de los lotes, o sea, lo estamos catando. Los lotes que tienen más de 6 puntos o 7 puntos se exportan como premium, o sea, un cacao fino de aroma de alta calidad. Usualmente son microlotes de 2 a 5 toneladas, no podemos encontrar lotes de 20, 25 toneladas que tienen puntajes de catación de 7, es muy difícil, pero un cacao que tiene un puntaje de 6, 7, es un cacao muy agradable, muy rico. Cusco, Satipo, Pichari, Pasco, Ucayali, las muestras que estamos logrando que alcancen estos puntajes de catación son donde hay más cacao sembrado criollo y menos SN, ¿no? San Martín, lamentablemente, por ser una región que tiene muchos SN51, no llega a tener esos puntajes de catación de 7, pero otras regiones que no tienen tantos SN51 sí logran tener ese puntaje. Y hay que aprovechar esos precios. Hay clientes que sí pagan precios de $3,000 la tonelada, ¿no? Fácilmente, o más aún, pero son microlotes, ¿no? Que sí se puede trabajar, hay que trabajar mucho la post cosecha. La post cosecha del cacao es muy importante para lograr estos puntajes de catación, ¿no? Y yo creo que en el Salón del Cacao y el Chocolate se va a ver mucho de eso, ¿no? Van a haber muchas empresas que lleven cacaos muy finos, muy agradables, pero en microlotes, ¿no? En microlotes, ¿no? Gracias por ese lado.
No, sí, o sea, es muy importante decir que el Perú pues tiene una oferta variada de cacao, ¿verdad? Tiene esto, tiene los certificados, inclusive tiene orígenes específicos como Piura, por ejemplo, que van destacando, pero hay que entender que cada uno tiene un segmento bastante específico, como bien lo dijo Judith, hay demandas específicas. El mainstream o el volumen va un poco en lo que se ha enfocado en la presentación de Judith. Bueno, estamos a punto de terminar. Yo quería más bien agradecer a Judith, agradecer a José. Van a quedar preguntas, vamos a guardarlas. Como he dicho, el próximo año vamos a traer a Judith. Creo que la cantidad de interacción que ha generado con café y con cacao nos hace muy
So I would like
interesante.
to be able to make one more comment.
Ok,
And just in response to what you said about the organic and the market. So I'm going to use myself as the example. Okay. And you might not want to hear, but I don't really pay that much attention to organic. Okay. But I will pay very high prices for a chocolate that I think is good because I don't necessarily associate. I mean, I know organic doesn't have the chemicals and everything else, but in terms of the chocolate itself, I'm looking for other properties. And I think that Peru touches on that. And therefore, maybe if there's problems in terms of the labeling on the organic and everything else, you could still probably fetch just as high prices by marketing your chocolate as superior because of other qualities and properties. And I think that, you know, you can't, that message needs to be made to just kind of figure out a different playing field because I think there's certainly demand. And I want to just say that, I mean, I'm a crazy enough consumer of chocolate that I live in Panama. I'm a New Yorker, but my favorite chocolate shop in the world happens to be in Berlin. And if I'm traveling to Europe or through Frankfurt to go to a coffee conference in Africa, I will book a flight. I will take an extra plane flight to Berlin to go to this chocolate shop that I love. And now they deliver within the US for free, but I also have it delivered to me in the United States. So I think people will go to great lengths for good chocolate. And just keep that in mind. Because if I'm doing it, then other people are also. I'm not unique. And that shop in Berlin also has Peruvian chocolate that's labeled as single origin Peruvian. But if you could differentiate it and put the different geographical regions on it, just like Guatemala or Colombia does in coffee, then I think that's where the marketing needs to be. Because then not only would I just buy the Peruvian, I'd also then buy from each region because I want to sample all of it and taste the differences.
Sí, muchas gracias, Judith, muchas gracias, José.
You're very welcome.
Vamos a vernos próximamente, Judith. En nombre del señor Luis Navarro, que fue quien nos contactó,
Okay. With pleasure.
muy agradecido. También a José Mejía, amigo de la casa, bastante cercano a nosotros, y a las personas que nos han acompañado. Gracias, va a haber una encuesta de satisfacción al final. Justamente siguiendo en la dieta, en la tarde vamos a hablar sobre nutrición con chocolate y café, y después cómo las redes sociales y el comercio electrónico también han impulsado justamente lo que hablamos, ¿verdad? El mercado para productos diferenciados en ambas cadenas. En nombre de la Cámara Peruana de Café y Cacao, de los aliados que tenemos, vuelvo a repetir, a la cooperación suiza en el Perú seco, a USAID con sus proyectos Alianza Cacao y Café con TecnoServe, a PNUD y a todos los que nos permiten estar acá. Gracias por acompañarnos y nos vemos en la tarde. Hasta luego, José. Muchas gracias, Judith.
Thank you. With
Gracias.
pleasure. Stay healthy, everybody.